Okay, hi everybody. So today I'm going to talk about efforts. And so what I will do basically is proposing a definition of individual efforts that I will then extend to collective ones. And the core, maybe interesting idea of the talk is that I think we should understand efforts in terms of force. And if we then extend this definition of effort, of individual efforts to collective ones, then we should understand collective efforts in terms of force also. And I want to argue that it might be interested to conceptualize the entities of the social world, or at least some entities of the social world in terms of force. And so here is the plan. So I will define efforts in the first place, and then the force-based analysis of effort that I will propose will enable me to propose three different ways to identify collective efforts. Because so basically, I will argue that efforts are actions where the agent acts by resisting to some force. And this definition implies that there are three different ways then in which we can identify collective effort. And at the end, in the third part, I will show what I think are maybe the advantages of understanding the social world in terms of forces. So first, what is effort? And let me start briefly by mentioning this fact, what seems to be a fact to me, that there are different kinds of efforts. So it is better, maybe the idea is better introduced by this common, ordinary idea that there are at least two kinds of effort, which are the physical ones, such as the one doing by Rocky in this picture, or mental or moral or intellectual one, such as the one probably done by the thinker of Rodin. And so first, a good theory of effort should be able to account for all this variety, or on first sight at least. And it is not, and what is difficult in theorizing effort is that sometimes we just focus ourselves on one kind of effort. So it is the case, for instance, in this talk by Gwen Bradford, when she identifies effort to exertion of will. So what we do when we resist a temptation, or when we try to lift very heavy weights, for instance. And here what I want to say is not that what she is describing doesn't count as effort. It does, but it's not. It is too narrow a picture to reduce effort to reduce efforts to efforts of will, basically. Because what do you do in an effort of will? Well, you resist temptation, basically, generically. And what I want to show to you is that effort is indeed a matter of resisting something, that can be conceptualized as force, but it is not reducible to mental forces, because not only so do we make efforts of will, but as it is illustrated in this quote, we make efforts against on the world. So when we lift heavy weights, for instance, so we make indeed mental efforts when we solve problems, when we concentrate, but we also make efforts on others, such as when we try to seduce someone, or to convince someone. And so what I want to propose is that we should understand efforts so in terms of resisting force. And the first underlying commitment of this claim is that efforts are essentially tied to actions, which is not something that is always taken for granted, because there are many texts or discussions in which it seems that the people using efforts equate efforts to some kind of feelings. And so efforts would be things that we always feel and that happen to us rather than things we do. And the first commitment I want to make here, that I want to take, is that efforts are not, we may or not feel our efforts, but it's not the essential point. The essential point is that efforts are tied to action. And the first idea that goes with it is that efforts are somehow productive. That is, you can produce things with effort. You can achieve things. So, for instance, you can win sport games, such as the boys on the left of the screen. You can seduce someone you love, such as these little angels. Or you can even win the US elections through efforts. Or another way to put in would be to say that efforts have success conditions in terms of goal. That is, when you represent the state of affairs that you want to achieve, that you desire, and well, you can achieve it through efforts, but you can also fail. And so, for these reasons, and there are others, but those are the principal ones. We should, I think, consider that efforts are essentially tied to actions. And so once you agree with that, once you agree that efforts are somehow connected essentially to actions, the question is, okay, so what do we learn when we say that this action not only is an action, whatever it is, but that it is also an effort? And here, so I argue that what we learn when we say not only that this is an action, but it's also an effort, is that the action is accomplished, or that the agent tries to accomplish the action by resisting to some force. So not only is Pierre lifting a stone, is also exerting a mechanical force against the force exerted by the stone. Or not only is Janie resisting, not only is Janie going to do some sport early in the morning, but she is also resisting a temptation not to go to run in the morning. So the basic structure of effort sentence is that there is a means action, so which is directed at some goal, and effort indicates something with respect to that means action, and argue that it specifies that it is effected by resisting to some force. And so just to go short, there is one other way to understand the supplementary property of effortful actions by contrast to mere actions. And it is to understand it in terms of limited resources consumptions. And here, let me briefly explain why I prefer the force account. The problem with the resource is that resources are actually essential to actions, also I argue, because whenever you act, whether it is a bodily movement, a purely bodily movement, or if it is a more meaningful actions, such as a speech, or such as reading a book, or even thinking instead of daydreaming, in all of these cases, you are consuming more resources than if you are not doing anything else. So you are consuming more glucose or any other subtract basic resources than you would do if you are not acting. And so in this sense, consuming limited resources is a matter of it is actually an internal condition of action rather than something more that we learn with respect to this action being an effort. And so to grasp the difference, the 2 point of view between the two views, so consider that the movement of a car is the action of an agent, and so we consider only the movement of the car that is an effect of its engine functioning, not someone pushing it or the wind or the slope or whatever. And so if whenever the car moves in this way, so or whenever an agent acts, it has to, in the case of the car, deplete some limited resources. So in this case, oil, gas, or hydrogen, electricity, or whatever. And I think it's exactly the same for an agent when he acts. And so, on the contrary, when you consider efforts in the force-based sense, you mention not only that the action was performed, of course, by with all the internal conditions being met, but also that the car or your agent was facing some resistance. So the air resistance that is always the case basically when you take the car, or the mud resistance, which is less quite often. And so it enables me to really define efforts as so the trying to act or the action that we try to do by resisting to some force in order to produce some desired outcomes. And so the advantage of this view in terms of force is that it it makes possible to account for the diversity of effort by postulating diverse kinds of force. So you make efforts on the world when you act against mechanical forces, so such as Atlas holding the world literally on the left. You make efforts on yourself when you resist temptation, a desire, or whatever, such as Saint Anthony in the painting of the middle. And you also make efforts on others, so others as body when you fight, for instance, and others as minds when you try to convince them of whatever. And so what do we learn there with respect to collective efforts through this definition? And what we learn is that there are three ways in which we can identify efforts. So the first option is just to say, okay, so I will consider that a collective effort is that occurs when at least two people make an effort, that is when they resist a force, whatever the reason for which they resist it. So it means they might face the same temptation for different goals, but I consider it a collective effort. So for instance, we can think of three people who resist against a mental force, in this case their desire to eat meat, but for completely or at least different reasons. So one on behalf of the animal care, or the other one on behalf of health issue, or and the last one on behalf of environmental reasons. And so in this idea, you identify collective efforts by the common enemy of the different agents. And so let me call that joint effort, just to give it a name. So as the action that at least two agents perform by resisting one similar force. And so then of course, there is some work to be done about what does it mean to have the same resistance. So two people pushing the same rock, for instance, they face the resistance of the same object. But two people facing the same kind of desire, do they face exactly the same resistance? But so this is one way to identify efforts. The second way is to identify efforts with respect not to the resistance, but to the goal. So of course, if since we have defined efforts in terms of resisting to a force or acting despite a resistive force, there must be some resistance in the story, but the resistance need not be the same for the different agents that we are considering. All that needs to be the case is that there are at least two people who resist to some force, but for the same goal. And so you can take this example when you have two people who have the same goal. They want to do something against climate change by against facing some desire that they have, so by resisting some inner force. But they do not do it by resisting to the same desire, to the same force locally. And so let me call it group effort, against just another name, as the action of at least two agents that resist different forces, but for the same goal. And so the last one, of course, is, let's say, the full-blown collective effort type of identification. When you consider that at least two people are making collective effort, if and only if on the first side they have the same goal, the same intention, and on the other side they also face the same resistance. And so maybe you can create a collective effort in the full-blown sense of the term, and so it ends up in this table when you can see the three different ways to identify efforts. And so here I don't want to take any stand with respect to how we should actually identify it. I just want to, actually what I want to do is to argue for a force-based analysis of society, of social things. And these different ways to identify efforts are just a part of this, are just an illustration of what we can do with this force-based framework. And so the question then is, what do we learn, for instance, with this distinction, but also with more generally a force-based account of social entities? So first, so we have to get clear on what we mean by a social force, since it is the basic element of the analysis. And so we would say that a social entity, be it a firm, a political party, a sport team, a state, whatever, just a group of people. So this social entity has some force, if and only if. It has a direction, because every force has a direction. And in the case of social entities, the direction is akin to goals, that is a social group that aims at producing some changes in the society, is directed towards this changes. So it does not need to be intentional. So for instance, any social group that acts in the way it acts will change society in some way, and those changes are explainable by what values they want to make obtain in the social world. And so so this is the first point. Any social entity having a force must aim intentionally or not at orientating a society's evolution, some direction. And then a force not only has a direction, but also an intensity, and it must push in this direction with a certain force. For instance, a little political party will not push society in the same in its direction with the same force than a big political party, for instance. And so moving back, going back to what we have to our social effort. So if we consider, for instance, the first way in which we can identify efforts in terms of resistance. So what do we learn when we say that, let's say, this department in this company is making an effort against some resistance, whatever it is. And well, we learn that they face a resistance that they can represent, and so they it means that they believe in this in the existence of this resistance, and so we can learn things about their social representation, but also if they resist to some resistance, or think about demonstrations, for instance. If some people demonstrate against other people, against something, it means that they believe what they demonstrate against has some force in this society, and is pushing society towards this direction. And so I have to stop right now because it's the end. But so the advantage of a force-based analysis of society is that it permits a more dynamic comprehension of the social phenomenon, and I think at some points it is better. It has a better grasp to. It is a better insight to how social groups or social entities work in the social world.